Rima is here. Yes, and we have now reached our panel of children and childhood. My name is Boaz Cohen. I think I've met most of you. There is no more appropriate subject to talk about ego documents and their importance for giving the personal in the research and talking about children and sources concerning children. But of course, this will bring us, as we shall see in the presentations, to the question is, are we seeing really the children, or are we seeing someone else when we hear the children? Is it them, or is them the adults inside? But it is true that giving children a voice is certainly a place of ego documents, and also talking about children in certain settings is like that. So, as from what I gathered from your subjects, I understand that we will see this really playing out. So we are having a change in the order. We'll start with Barnabas Balint from Magdalen College in the University of Oxford, speaking about They Became My Children Too, the multi-layered meanings of family letters from the Jewish Maquis in France during the Second World War. We will continue with Dora Patricia of Abo Academy University, Hungary. First time I saw my father cry, ego document stories behind deportation from Siget. And we will end with Ekterina Oleshkovich from Bar-Ilan University on childhood and autobiographies, reflection on actual childhood or a product of adult beliefs. Okay, so everyone has 25 minutes. Barnabas, the floor is yours. If you want to say anything more about yourself, just say it. And we'll have the discussion after 3 presentations. So Barnabas, please.
Thank you. I shall share my screen. As Boaz has said, I'm Barnabas. I'm currently doing my doctorate at Magdalen College here in Oxford. I actually focus on the Holocaust in Hungary and looking at Jewish youth in Hungary, but the thing I'll be talking about today looks at France, which is based on my master's work that I did last year. And so I'd like to start by taking you back to the 6th of June 1944, when Robert Gamson, the leader of the Jewish Scouts of France, wrote a letter to his wife Denise about a local underground scout group that he'd visited. The group was situated just across the Agout River in southern France from another team that he'd worked closely with already. And when their leader had to move away, Gamson assumed charge of this new group too. Writing to his wife, he explained this new development in a code that not only helped obscure his true meaning from the censors, but also reflected his approach to scouting. He said, "I'm now their father too." Now, Robert Gamson was born in 1905 and he lived until he died in Israel in 1961. Aged 18 in 1923, he helped found the Éclaireurs Israélites de France, the Jewish Scouts of France. These Jewish Scouts formed an important part of the broader scouting movement in France, alongside religious denominational groups of all sorts. Unlike other Jewish scout movements across Europe, however, the EIF was not political, and it attracted young Jews from across the ideological spectrum. After the fall of France in the Second World War, Gamson worked to re-establish the EIF in southern France because, as yet unoccupied by the Germans, southern France became a refuge for large numbers of Jews fleeing persecution. Following the increasingly popular tradition of Hakshara, Gamson set up rural training camps for young Jews to learn agricultural skills and to reconnect with their Judaism. And as the war went on, the EIF became increasingly radicalized towards underground resistance and rescue activities. All the time operating under the auspices of the 6th Division, which was a youth division of an organization called the General Union of Jews in France. The EIF was able to develop a clandestine wing known as the CZM, the 6th, whilst also having this official front. And this enabled them to maintain an official above-board perspective, whilst also forging identity papers and smuggling children to safety in Spain and in Switzerland. After the Jewish Scouts were officially disbanded in January 1943, Gamson moved them further underground, establishing a movement in the southern Tarn mountainous area of France. By June 1944, this became a full fighting unit known as the Compagnie Marc Huguenot, after one of its commanders who was killed in battle. This paper will look at the letters between Robert Gamson and his wife and children in hiding during the Second World War. It will show the multi-layered meanings of that the letters held in a dual purpose: to emotionally connect two members of a family at a dangerous time, and to secretly pass details about the Maquis. The collection of 10 letters spans from May to July 1944, covering the time during which Robert Gamson transformed the EIF from a half-clandestine scouting and rescue operation to a full Maquis fighting force. The letters he sent to his family in hiding offer a window into his personal experience of this, as he shared his feelings and his emotions about their successes and their failures. In doing so, they make it possible to recognize and understand the human man at the center of a story of persecution and resistance. The letters, however, were more than just personal correspondence of a wartime leader. They're also a means of secret communication about the resistance. Recognizing this dual purpose changes how we understand the letters as ego documents, as they were part of multiple historiographies. They're a document created not only for the individual, but also for the institution and the resistance. On the 30th of June 1944, Robert Gamson turns 39 years old. Surrounded by fellow scouts and living an underground existence after Jewish scouting had been banned the previous year, they nonetheless celebrated his birthday with presents and joviality. When Gamson wrote to his wife a few days later, he recalled the occasion and the gifts of clothes, of a book, and of a wristwatch that he'd received. But he also added a deeply personal note, and one which stands out among his correspondence as deeply profound. It was, he said, since the beginning, the only evening where I felt the depression caused by your and the children's absence. I would have preferred to see fewer children, but my own. This reflection is a significant remark for Gamson to have made, as at all other times he talks deeply and passionately about his connection with the Scouts as if they were his own children. This single line in his letter therefore serves as a powerful reminder of how his private family life continued and remained something deeply important to him. In a narrative so heavily dominated by his work and the familial nature of the Scouts, recognizing Gamson's actual family is an important part of understanding the human story at the center of the narrative on resistance. In fact, the letters show the close connection that Gamson had with his wife, Denise, who herself held a major part in Jewish scouting during the war. Gamson treated her as his confidante, expressing his anxieties and his uncertainties, as well as his pride and triumph, at a time when the institutions he worked for the institutions he worked for and the ones he led, like the EIF, were in constant flux. On the 10th of June, for example, he wrote about how he was unsure which groups he should lead, and he even complained critically about some of the other leaders in the area, that they weren't getting on with the Scouts, that they weren't doing their jobs properly. Conversely, just 12 days later, on the 22nd of June, he was full of praise for other key figures in the movement about how well they got on with the Scouts, how well they were able to lead his movement. Despite this success, in the same letter, he commented about how he felt uncomfortable, saying, "It's a bit too beautiful for something so hard." Gamson's unease here is understandable. occupying as he did a senior role in an underground movement several years through the Second World War. By reading these letters, we gain a window into his personal anxieties as he presented them both consciously and unconsciously to the person who knew him the most. This is a side of Gamson that's rarely presented in historical literature. Indeed, when we think of a hero of the resistance, we don't imagine someone plagued with uncertainty and sometimes even depression. Yet we should, because recognizing this shows us the individual and the human existence at the center of a narrative of heroism. It rehumanizes a figure otherwise turned into myth, and it makes it possible to understand how Gamson's actions influenced his life and how he experienced the war himself. It was the first time in several years that I had 2 hours of peaceful work. Gamson reflected this in a letter to his wife on the 21st of May, 1944. Writing from his room in Castres in southern France, near Toulouse, Gamson tells here of the busyness and the intensity of his work. By May 1944, the Jewish Scouts had undergone several reformulations, becoming increasingly clandestine and oriented towards resistance. The stressfulness of this is brought into sharp focus in his letter on the 21st of May, where he explains that these 2 hours were interrupted by the news that a close friend of his, Leo Cohn, pictured here, had been arrested. A pre-war immigrant from Germany, Cohn had become the spiritual leader of the EIF and worked closely with Gamson and at their rural training camp in Lautrec in southern France, where he led the scout choir and religious services. Earlier in May 1944, Cohn had succeeded in smuggling his own wife and 3 children into Switzerland, where they thankfully survived the war. He himself, however, was arrested on the 16th of May while attempting to smuggle another group of children to safety. He was taken to the Drancy internment camp, from where he was later deported to his death in Auschwitz on the 77th convoy on the 31st of July, 1944. Cohn's arrest was the latest in a string of arrests and deportations that decimated the Jewish Scouts during the latter part of the war. When Gamson reported news of Cohn's arrest to his wife, he did so in a code, referencing a friend of his, Dr. Sigmund Hirsch, who'd been arrested, sent to Drancy, and also deported to Auschwitz on an earlier convoy in November 1943. Although Hirsch survived the camp, Gamson would not have known this and would not have known any of his fate when he heard that Cohn had been arrested too. And so he wrote, "He has been taken to the hospital where Jogo, Gamson's code name for Hirsch, was, and had without doubt the same treatment as him. It's terribly sad. I don't know if I can do well to talk to you about him, as you don't know him anymore. In all cases, we shan't talk about it to Rachel, Gamson's wife." This heartbreaking line tells of the immense loss and emotional trauma as Gamson lost yet another close friend, while also thinking of the wider community who knew him and how they might react. Its juxtaposition in his letter, next to a line about the first peaceful work he achieved in years, accentuates the ever-changing and the challenging environment that so characterized Gamson's wartime life. Expressing this roller coaster of emotion to his wife, our window into how he felt at the time, is best summarized by the last line of his letter. "The nature is so beautiful, but the people are so stupid." Although the letters were, at their core, the link between husband and wife, they also held a second purpose. This purpose was a means of communication about underground activities. And this enables us to learn about how the EIF, as a resistance organisation, operated, and how Gamson, as their leader, perceived of its work. Gamson was the coordinator, a fact that comes through in many of his letters, where he describes how he directed others to go on missions and recounts the activities of others in his command. On the 22nd of June, for example, he wrote that in order to hear news about what had happened to Leo Cohn, he sent Sancho. She is an old EI, a Jewish scout, Eclaver Israelet, from Strasbourg, and is active and resourceful. I await impatiently her return for news. Similarly, later on the 5th of July, Gamson again sought information about what was happening in another part of France, this time sending a girl called Jenny Cerf to Lyon, despite the danger that such a trip posed. The fact that both of these couriers are female is significant. Women were often used by underground movements right across Europe as couriers, largely because they were perceived as being less easily identifiable as Jewish. Gamson's comments here resonate with a statement he made after the war concerning Mark Avmon, another Jewish scout who helped coordinate underground activities with him. As from 1943, Gamson wrote, his service included to position all the youth of a mobilizing age for the Maquis that I directed, and for social assistance by working as smugglers. But when Gamson wrote this, he used the female version in French for the word smuggler, convoyeuse, rather than convoyeur, which would denote a male smuggler. This reflects the gendered association of smuggling and courier work with women that he had in his mind. That we see this gendered division in the letters to his wife too, reveals how much of an integral part female couriers were for the underground. When Gamson speaks of them, he's waiting impatiently. They are the lifeblood of the organization, as they provide the intelligence and the information vital to its success. In this way, the letters show us how the EIF operated as an underground organization, its similarities with others across Europe, and Gamson's central place within its activities. Just as Gamson had used a code to tell his wife about Leo Cohn's arrest, he also used coded language to describe the clandestine activities of the increasingly resistance-oriented Jewish scouts. Building on the medium of the family letter, Gamson employed family terms to refer to Maquis groups. On the 27th and 28th of May 1944, he told of how he'd met one underground group in Toulouse, writing in his letter that he had met Roger's children, and that the atmosphere of this family is remarkable. Similarly, on the 6th of June, he used the term Armand's children to refer to another Maquis group in the area. This code tells us much about how he approached the resistance. As a scout leader, Gamson had a close connection to the Jewish youth. The familial tone of these letters thus chimes with his familial approach to scouting and the Maquis. The children are the scouts, the families are the scout groups. So when he uses the phrase "my children" to refer to Maquis members, Gamson showed the profound connection that he had to his comrades. The family words employed to communicate news about the resistance were therefore more than a code to convey information and to hide it from others. They also expressed Gamson's relationship with the Maquis. Because of this, they hold a dual function, both as ego documents describing Gamson's personal experience and as sources that explain how the resistance functioned and what it meant for those involved. As Gamson reflected in a letter on the 5th of July, it is a family. The letters also convey the long history of the EIF as a movement, and as a movement that transitioned organically from scouting to resistance during the war. In several of the letters, Gamson refers to the Colonie de Vacances, the summer camps. These are children's summer camps that they organised before and at the beginning of the war as training centres for Jewish youth during their school holidays. But by the summer of 1944, these were no longer holiday camps, but centres of resistance and of rescue. Although certainly partially another example of this code, of this code that Gamson used to refer to the resistance, the continued use of this term is also again reflective of his broader approach to the underground as something that grew out naturally from pre-war scouting. His reliance on figures like Sancho, a former scout, as well as the preponderance of scout leaders within the higher echelons of the Maquis group, further attests to this fact. Gamson's letters, as ego documents with this duality of purpose, are ideally placed to convey this reality. The code Gamson used is a meaningful one which reflected his philosophy about the Jewish Scouts and was deeply rooted in it itself. Because of this, his personal ethos and the work of the group cannot be separated, as they were deeply intertwined and fed off each other. This moves us towards a better understanding of how the Jewish Scout Maquis was constructed, recognizing the long-term trajectory from Scout to Maquis and the intimate relationship and nature of the group. The letters are therefore a special type of ego document. They show us how Gamson's personal experiences and the work of the Jewish Scouts were deeply intertwined and inseparable from each other. As with other ego documents, the letters are imbued at every level with Gamson's individual personality and offer a highly unusual insight into the human man behind a heroic tale of resistance and rescue. Simultaneously, however, they have a clear institutional function, conveying the latest news about the Jewish Scouts and about the war, as well as reflecting the institutional structure and modus operandi of the underground movement. Because of this, they contribute to multiple historiographies, telling us something about resistance, about Judaism, about youth, and about gender in general, as well as the specific history of Robert Gamson, his emotions, and his life experiences. It is in this duality that they're most powerful. Recognizing, for example, how the coded language reflected Gamson's own approach to the Jewish Scouts, reveals how the institutional and the personal were two sides, but of the same coin. For a group like the EIF, where the individual characters like Gamson were pivotal for framing the culture of the movement, this duality sat at the heart of who they were. Thank you.
Thank you, Barnabas. This is fascinating.